Hi, welcome back to Purpose Driven Church for Unificationist. Today we're starting chapter 13, Worship Can Be a Witness. We're doing pretty good. We're 2/3 of the way through the book. So this chapter is all about Sunday service or worship service. And I think that this is something that we have to take with a grain of salt, that they really emphasize service as a worship experience, and we don't necessarily believe in worshiping God that way, I believe. So it's something to keep in mind. But at the same time, there's many great nuggets of wisdom and truth here. But they basically have 12 convictions about worship. I'll look at a couple of them, but basically one is that I thought was good is that he emphasizes there's no correct style of worship. There's all different kinds of people. He says the style of worship that you feel comfortable with says far more about your cultural background than it does about your theology. Regardless of style, true worship employs both your right brain and your left brain. It engages both emotion and intellect, your heart and your mind. We must worship in spirit and in truth. So the idea that the Sunday service experience should be something that is engaging of both our emotion and our intellect, all our senses. It should engage us fully as a whole person. He also says that the experience can also be a very powerful witness to other people who are there. If God's presence is felt, and if the message is understandable. So basically he's making the point that those two things are required. So he's talking about the Pentecost and Acts in the Bible, where he says there are these day where people came and that 3,000 people were converted. And he says, why were those 3,000 people converted? Because they felt God's presence and they understood the message. Both of these elements are essential in order for worship to be a witness. First, God's presence must be sensed in the service, and few people, if any, are converted to Christ on purely intellectual grounds. It is a sense of God's presence that melts people's hearts and explodes mental barriers. At the same time, the worship and the message needs to be understandable, and which kind of goes back to a lot of the other things that we talked about the message being in such a way that it's relatable and understandable to people. He emphasizes also that for the service to be effective, especially as a witness to others, we need to be sensitive about the fears, hang-ups, and needs of unbelievers when they are present in our worship service. So he talks about a verse in the Bible, and Paul is making that. He says we must be willing to adjust our worship practices when unbelievers are present. God tells us to be sensitive to the hang-ups of unbelievers in our services. Being seeker-sensitive in our worship is a biblical command. And he uses the example that when you have guests over to your home for dinner, does your family act differently than when it's just your family at the table? Of course they do. You pay attention to your guests' needs. Make sure they are served first. In the same way, the spiritual food is unchanged in a seeker-sensitive service, but the presentation is more thoughtful and considerate of the guests present. He says also that the worship service doesn't have to be shallow to be seeker-sensitive. This message doesn't have to be compromised, just understandable. He says making a service comfortable for the unchurched doesn't mean changing your theology. It means changing the environment of the service. Changing the environment can be done through the way you greet visitors, the style of music used, the translation of the Bible you preach from, and the kinds of announcement you make in the service. Being seeker-sensitive does not limit what you say, but it does affect how you say it. He's talking about when people come to your service, what they do want. They're not expecting a watered-down message, but they do expect to hear the Bible or whatever it is that you would be teaching. But they want it to relate to their lives in terms that they can understand, and in a tone that shows you respect and care about them. They are looking for solutions, not scolding. He also the next one is that just the recognition that the needs of people who are seeking for truth, or the seekers, and the needs of believers are not necessarily different. Many times they overlap. He says, for example, that seeker-sensitive services focus on needs common to both believers and unbelievers. For instance, both believers and unbelievers need to know what God is really like. Both need to understand the purpose of life. Both need to know why and how to forgive others. Both need help in strengthening their marriage and family, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really true. I think that sometimes we get into this mindset that we don't need the fundamentals, or like we don't need the applied relationship skills or things like that, or maybe that's just not important to us where we're at in our lives. Um, people want to hear more about theology or doctrine or providential things. But I think people need to recognize that the fundamentals are what guides us in our pursuits and accomplishments in life. And that's something that's universally needed by all kinds of people, whether it's our young people, older people, couples, children. Everyone's seeking for understanding and practical skills in these areas. And this is a way that you can meet all the different needs by giving a service that addresses those needs. Yeah, he also talks about that, if you're really serious about having a seeker evangelistic kind of program at your church through the Sunday service, that you should make a separate service that's really specifically geared towards bringing seekers or unchurched people. He says that way you can fine-tune that service towards those needs. That what they do at Saddleback is they actually do the seeker service on Sunday morning, because that's the most likely time that people will come to church if they're not a believer, if they're a seeker. And they make their more kind of nurturing service for their own members on a Wednesday. So I thought that was really interesting. They really, in terms of actually doing what they say they're going to do, they really do it. They really make the emphasis on the people who are coming to the church, visitors, unchurched people, not their own members. And he just goes on to emphasize just a few last points, that it takes all kinds of services to reach all kinds of people. There are only 3 non-negotiable elements of a seeker service. He says, you treat unbelievers with love and respect, you relate the service to their needs, and you share the message in a practical, understandable manner. And honestly, I would think that those are 3 non-negotiable elements of a regular service, of our own service, which I feel like, we look at those 3 things and I just feel like, yeah, we have not really been doing that as a movement as a whole. Maybe in some places people do that, but I think that in general, those 3 things are not necessarily emphasized. But he says that fundamentally, in the end, you can do all the different things. You can use all little tools and knickknacks and strategies. But he says what really attracts large numbers of people to a church is changed lives. A lot of changed lives. People want to go where lives are being changed, where hurts are being healed, and where hope is being restored. In almost every seeker service, we include a real-life testimony from a person or couple who has been changed dramatically by coming to Christ. It's hard to argue with. And he just says lastly that really you shouldn't even consider doing a seeker service if your membership is not at a mature level spiritually, where they're really able to put aside their own needs and preferences in a service and really make the emphasis on the preferences and needs and concerns of other people. And that's just the way it is. That's his experience, and makes sense to me. All right, so thanks a lot. Sorry I went a little long today, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, and see you tomorrow.